Welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Here to talk all things hockey are your hosts, Brad Crisco, Ryan Hanna, and Evan Lobsinger.
Who feels worse right now? Coyotes fans? And I know it's Coyotes fans.
No.
Or Evan, who is here in this room smelling terrible after 18 holes and lost his very expensive rangefinder.
That was probably the worst 18 holes of golf I've played in 3 years. I was horrendous, and then the last 2 holes I couldn't find my rangefinder.
Honestly, if it was up to me, I'd say you should have played better and not lost your rangefinder.
It was not for a lack of trying. I just suck ass at golf.
And yet,
I smell like ass. It's all been a great day.
Coyotes fans still do feel worse. This saga is, we're doing it again. And is this going to be the last time? Anyhow, there's a lot to cover on this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. Here to talk to you about all things Red Wings hockey, the world of the NHL, what the hell is going to happen to the Arizona Coyotes, more on the 2023 NHL Draft, the NHL Playoffs, and lots more. I am one of your hosts, Ryan Hanna.
I'm Brad Crisco.
And I'm Evan.
On this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast, as Brad and I plug our noses, we are going to recap what has happened in Arizona and the vote in Tempe that has left that entire franchise in flux, and that's saying something considering that seems to be the state it permanently exists in. What's next for the Coyotes? We'll hash out what the opportunities might be for them to stay in Arizona, or maybe even more likely go elsewhere now. We are joined this episode by Scott Wheeler of The Athletic. It's about that time of year where we have Scott on, and always a really great insight into the NHL Draft, and no different this time around as he lets us know about what to look forward to in the 2023 draft class. And then we'll be back with you to talk conference finals in the South, because that is who is in the conference finals, is the southernmost conference finals in NHL history. Really interesting makeups of teams and 2 fantastic series coming up. All that and more. So before we get into that, I want to let you know that the entirety of the Winged Wheel Podcast, all of our work to support the Jamie Daniels Foundation, our growth into an expanded content universe, launching the new show Expected by Whom, hosted by Prashant Iyer and Sean Shapiro, that is all supported by our Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. In addition to supporting those things, you get great benefits like our Patreon exclusive bonus episodes, where I'm sure you're going to hear Evan tee off, pun not intended. You get access to our Patreon exclusive Discord, and you also are entered automatically into all of our giveaways. This last season, we gave away 2 tickets to every Red Wings home game. The majority of them went to Patreon supporters directly. Patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast to join the Dub Club. We thank you all eternally for those who have supported us through that. Brad's ready for this. You are so ready to tee off about this, but let me recap first what
I don't want to tee off. Just going to ask some hypothetical questions.
There was a council vote to essentially approve the arena deal that was proposed to be the Arizona Coyotes' permanent home in Tempe, Arizona. A deal that was largely privately funded, actually, I'll say, but not completely. There were tax breaks and things like that. I think, without getting into the minutia of it, about 200 to 300 million in that would fall on the taxpayers in one way or another. Essentially, what they wanted to do is convert an old dump that needed to be detoxified, quite literally, into sports entertainment complex, housing, theater, etc. What is the typical of like the 2000s era arena proposal? Now, the council could have approved this themselves last year. They kicked it to a vote, and I mean, the league and the Coyotes were pretty optimistic, and it was not particularly close of a no from the citizens of Tempe. It was 56-44, and thus what seemed like the last-ditch effort for the Arizona Coyotes is shot down. They're currently playing in Mullet Arena. The team and the league have confirmed that they are going to be playing in Mullet Arena next season, barring anything crazy happening. But as of right now, their future is in flux. This is, not out of the realm of possibility. I'll say it's wild, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. And, before we dive into what's next for the Coyotes, I want to say this feels avoidable. Of course, the citizens of Tempe will vote for what they want to vote for. I'm not going to get into what's actually good for them and what's bad for them. I don't live there. I don't know the finer details of the deal. I don't know the impacts on their taxes. None of that. So I'm not going to say, yes, they were right or wrong. But from a Coyotes perspective, I think it was reported that they spent about $250,000 on advertising, getting out the vote, things like that, promotional efforts to essentially get this deal put through, a $2.1 billion deal. The folks who were working against the vote, who wanted to vote no, which was largely backed by some pretty strong labor unions, spent $2 million. That's 8 times as much against. And they were organized and they worked hard, and people are complaining about misinformation campaigns and whatever. And I'm sure to a large degree that's true, but they spent 8 times as much. They lost, they got outspent, outmaneuvered, outplayed, and now they have no home in Arizona for the foreseeable future. So this just feels like another tale of penny wise, pound poor. And now Arizona is at the end of the road, it seems.
Do I say it?
Go ahead. Say the line, Bart.
What are we even doing here? And, I want to make it clear, this isn't a black and white situation. I understand the Coyotes have a ton of diehard fans, and, that's who I feel bad for. I don't feel bad for the Arizona Coyotes franchise or their owners in the least. The only people I feel bad for in this entire situation are the fans because, despite all the memes, they're out there. They're going to be the ones who are hurt by this. The NHL and the owners are coming out and saying, for the most part, all the right things. The only things they can say today as we record this, we're going to play in Arizona this season. We're still committed to the city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to sit here and rip on how stupid that is, but I understand that's all they can say right now.
Can I interject with one thing?
Yeah, go for it.
The league has 2 reasons to say Arizona's going to be playing in mullet next year. 1, they need to buy whatever stability and time they can for Arizona's sake. 2,
exactly.
They're trying to sell the Ottawa Senators for $1 billion, and if those people making those bids think that there's a relocation effort potentially happening or a very cheap sale for a team that does not have the stability of the Senators.
We'll take the cheap team.
Yeah.
We'll take the Costco brand.
Right? So it's in the league's interest to keep them off the market for as long as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm not ripping on the league and the team for the generic, nothing burger statements that they have put out there. What I will say is that this clown show has gone on long enough. Like, there is no future in Arizona. There just isn't. I'm sure they will look at other avenues, to which most people who are way more plugged into the situation than I am say there really aren't any feasible ones. There's a couple long shots. But, there's so many ways you can look at this that is just a huge problem. Now, 1, I understand Coyotes ownership got outspent in the marketing for this vote, and there is a fundamental problem in that. But even going beyond that, if Coyotes fans, because there's about 30,000 votes in this.
I'm not sure, but
the arena is supposed to hold 20,000 people. If you get 20,000 people to come out on this vote, they would have won it in a landslide. They could not get enough fans to be half-assed to come out and vote to keep the team.
Well, they would have to live in the city of Tempe.
That's kind of the point, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Right? So if there is that few people in Tempe who give a crap about the Coyotes, this was never viable to begin with. Because this was my whole point a year ago, 2 years ago, when this plan said, yeah, you're going to go and spend money on this beautiful new arena. And don't get me wrong, it was a good plan. We obviously saw the mock-ups, what it was supposed to be. If done properly and, actually completed, this would have been a fantastic venue, great for the Coyotes, and it would have been half empty. Like, they would have done all of this 3 years in a college arena, billions of dollars to build something that would have sat half empty, and they would have been here. And this vote proves that. There was not enough people who cared. Now, they have a huge problem because, there's a lot of reports out there that players are unhappy with this situation. The NHL owners are unhappy with this, revenue sharing leech. The players are on the Coyotes are unhappy with the uncertainty around the situation. Clayton Keller's dad's piping off on Twitter for whatever that's worth. Like, this has to end. Like, just plain and simple, rip the Band-Aid off. I understand the logistics of they might have to play this season in Mullet Arena because, Salt Lake City or Houston or Quebec City or whatever it might be isn't going to be ready in time. And that's very, very understandable. So I don't fault them for playing this season, and I don't fault them for their statements, but behind the scenes, they have to be taking bids. They have to be looking at other options. Like, Arizona's dead. Like, every dollar spent on trying to keep them there is a waste, because this has been a franchise that has existed for nearly 30 years, and it has been headache after new ownership, after new arena problems, after all this garbage. And I understand people say, hey, winning can solve this. And yes, sure. But that's never guaranteed. Just ask Atlanta. The Coyotes have made it to the conference finals, once in their franchise history? I'm sorry. Like, again, what are we doing here? When you have to work this hard to just keep something alive, let alone thrive, you're wasting your time. You have to pull the plug. This is insane. And I'm sure behind the scenes, and again, I'm saying all of this talking like Bettman and the ownership aren't looking at all avenues. Of course they are.
They had avenues they were looking at before this vote even came to pass.
Ryan Smith, who owns the Utah Jazz of the NBA, he's already replied to someone on Twitter asking about bringing the Coyotes to Salt Lake City, and he said it's already in motion in terms of, fielding out options. And I think it was Andy Strickland reported that a lot of people internally on the Coyotes right now are looking at Salt Lake City as the primary, which would be probably a pretty good market for the NHL in that area. It's working in Seattle. Colorado's a great market. So, that northwestern part of the U.S., or just western part, is viable. With Salt Lake City looking to make a bid for the 2030 Olympics, that is an excuse to build a brand new giant-ass arena if they get it. So, there's no good solutions here, because apparently Houston's ownership's not, super hot to trot.
Which is so surprising, because that's the perfect market for
I agree.
For the Coyotes.
Quebec City is very, very interested as always, but they're in the East. They lack the corporate backing, etc. So there's no perfect market right now, and I understand that. So when I'm railing against Arizona, it's not like I'm railing against a Toronto here, and I know that. But every one of these other options with the questions they have is infinitely more viable than Arizona is right now. The NHL is a business to make money. The Arizona Coyotes have been a drain on that every year of their existence, nearly. It's just crazy to me that, it even got to this point, let alone the fact that they haven't immediately pulled the plug, which I understand they can't.
The only thing at this point that I would actually seriously entertain as a possible solution is the new owner of the Phoenix Suns, Mat Ishbia, who's a Michigan State University grad, actually. The previous ownership with the Suns, Sarver, he didn't want to play nice with any other Phoenix franchise or Arizona franchise that he didn't own or could make money from. So they play in what's called the Footprint Center. If they could outfit that arena, and it would need updates to host the Coyotes, and he's willing to play nice and play partner, then by all means, that might be an actual okay solution that I can get behind. But by and large, I think I'm with you, Brad, now that if that doesn't come to fruition, you're not going to find, it's just not there. And what has the NHL seen from the Vegas Golden Knights and the Seattle Kraken? They print money. They generate new fans and new markets, or markets that weren't tapped into the NHL, and opening up their wallets for jerseys and merch and gate and food and whatever, which is why Quebec City is not going to be the top of the list. Eastern Conference and imbalance, that's an excuse. The NHL doesn't actually care for the procedural part of it. They'll work their way around that. It's because it's not going to create new money for the league. Those are rabid hockey fans in Canada and Quebec. They are spending their money on hockey already. And the Canadian dollar is worth less. If they can open up a market in Houston, if they can open up a market in Salt Lake City, if they can open up a market, I don't know how much I buy into this one, but Atlanta has returned. There are so many places that are wanting to jump in, and professional sports teams aren't easy to acquire, and they can see that the NHL has an opportunity here. If I'm Gary Bettman, aside from talking to Ishbia and seeing if he's willing to play ball here, no pun intended, I'm going hard at Houston, and I'm trying to find a way to pivot this so that this can now be a franchise that's going to generate money like the Golden Knights and the Kraken. That's just where you're at. The road, you've run out of runway.
I woke up this morning and opened up Twitter with one eye open, and the first thing I saw was this vote in Tempe not going through, and I was like, I thought this was for sure going to happen. Like, it made too much sense, and like it was such a nice sweetheart deal for the city to take it. I haven't like totally come down to earth from reading that. It's like,
yeah,
if you're not going to take that deal, you're not going to take any deal. Like, it's just not going to work. And the whole situation, I mean, we've talked at length every single time the Arizona Coyotes kind of stumble their way through the door. There's cities out there who want to welcome an NHL team, have huge arenas ready to go. You know what? I feel bad for the players. I feel terrible for the fans because players have to uproot their lives. Fans lose their team, but if we've done it in Atlanta a couple of times, we may as well just do it one more time.
Atlanta, that one fails. It goes back to Arizona because all of a sudden they approve an arena deal there, and in 15 years they go to Kansas City, and then after that, yeah, it's just going to play hot potato.
But the one point you brought up about the Suns owner is a good one, but it also neglects one thing right now. The Coyotes don't have a fan base in Phoenix because when was the last time they played there? Like, if I'm the Suns owner, there is zero chance I'm spending hundreds of millions of dollars to retrofit my arena for an arena that I think would be half full.
Well,
and again,
some of that would come from the league. Some of that would come from the Coyotes.
No, I understand. But also, man, like, winning cures all. Like, I understand that. You look at a lot of the markets. Dallas has been a phenomenal hockey market, and the Stars are a competitive team way more often than they're not. Tampa Bay, the California teams, Vegas. Southern markets can work and can thrive. I've fully bought into it's more about ownership than it is location. At this point, if you market a team properly and ice a competitive team, you can succeed basically anywhere. We've heard all the stories about the current owners of the Coyotes, so I have zero faith in them to do anything right. And your point about them barely spending money to get this vote passed kind of more reinforces that more. Also, have you seen the Coyotes roster? Yeah, winning cures all. Not going to happen in whatever new arena they go to.
Yeah.
This team's going to be awful for years. So if you want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, wherever that money's coming from, to retrofit the Phoenix Suns arena, going to be half empty for years.
I mean, I don't know the economy of arena outfits, but I don't think it would be hundreds of millions.
Well, however much it's spent is going to be money completely pissed away.
Imagine they won Connor Bedard and all of a sudden this vote didn't go through.
Well, the NHL the conspiracy theory, NHL knew it wasn't going to go through, so they rigged it for Chicago.
Yeah, they kept Arizona away.
Someone actually asked me a good question today that I think would have brought an interesting point. If Arizona won the draft lottery, does this vote go through?
I don't think the people who voted no against it give a shit about Connor Bedard.
But would more people have come out to vote?
Yeah.
But so I don't know if it would have fully swung it, but for me, this was kind of the one defensive Gary Bettman you can have, because if he was going to rig the draft lottery, Arizona was who was going to be getting them.
We're about to become less popular than disc golf at this rate. Cut the cord, cut the Mickey Mouse BS, and become a real league. Like, stop doing all this garbage. Yeah. Just admit it's not working. Everything is pointing towards that. It's time to move on. Get an ownership group who wants to actually make some money and do it by the books.
This is no longer the era of the NHL where you need to send Wayne Gretzky out to California to solidify hockey there, which was a success. This is no longer the era of the NHL where you have to go down to Texas and give them a team and solidify hockey there, which was a success. This is no longer the era of the NHL where people don't know what hockey is. It is the era of the NHL where you're being outpaced financially, which, like it or not, is the name of the game in terms of growing your sport by other major professional sports leagues. Don't look now, but the MLS has passed the NHL.
We're going to be a professional cornhole podcast at some point.
Don't threaten me with a good time, man. You have to. You're right, Evan. You have to stop with this Mickey Mouse stuff. And I don't say that lightly. I genuinely wanted, like, as much as Brad, like, and I'm not maligning you here. You were saying get them out of there a long time ago, and probably really fairly. I was saying I want to see this work in Arizona because I think it's cool. I want it to work the same way it works in Texas. I want it to explode the same way it did in California. But you have ownership groups ready in Salt Lake City, in Houston, whether or not they're hot to trot right now, they were at least very interested before. That's a major metro area. Atlanta's interested again. Kansas City,
Quebec City, Sacramento apparently has shown interest.
From a hockey purist standpoint, the answer to me is Quebec City, and just make sure Detroit doesn't go back out west because I can't deal with that many 10:30.
It would be Columbus probably, but still.
But yeah, fine by me. But at this point, I have to agree with you. I mean, in a different era of the NHL, I could say I can see why you want to hang out here and make it stick. But now that's just not where you're at. You don't have to do that, and you're actually pissing away not just money but growth of the sport by not sending it elsewhere.
Yeah, if the NHL was the NFL or the MLB, it's one thing. I mean, this would not happen. Well, I don't know. I'll let you guys speak more to that, but I would imagine they run their ship a little bit tighter than that.
Feels like it.
Depends on
the MLB sometimes.
Yeah, the crap with the Tampa Bay Rays right now is a little infuriating.
Yeah, that is definitely fair, but. Like, with the amount of money they generate and the way they run their businesses, you gotta copy them a little bit, and you gotta start acting like a big boy.
Well, there's going to be a lot on Arizona coming up, especially as we try to figure out where they're going to go next. I liked these conversations when we were talking about expansion, but it does make me a little sad when it talks about, fan bases, fans losing their team. That sucks. We are privileged as fans of an Original Six team that's not going anywhere to never have had that fear. And I was thinking today, if I thought my hometown's professional sports team that I was like a diehard fan of went away, I don't know what I would do with myself.
I was thinking about that too. I was like, imagine we were a Coyotes podcast.
Oh my God. What do you do?
What if they moved to Quebec City? We'd have to learn to speak French.
That's the end. That's it for you.
I'm out. That's where I draw the line.
All right, folks. Well, there's going to be a lot to come on that. Coyotes fans, genuinely, we're sorry. This sucks. Okay, let's get on to some more happy stuff, which is Detroit's 2 first-round picks, their plethora of second-round picks, and more. Here to talk to us about all that is Scott Wheeler of The Athletic. It's been a while since we've had Scott on. And he has joined the show today, doing so completely under the weather. So kudos to Scott, who puts on a great show, and you would never know he's sick. So thank you, Scott. Hope you guys enjoy this interview. It's really fantastic, and you're going to learn a lot about the 2023 NHL Draft. It's been a long time, but we're really happy to have back on the Winged Wheel podcast to talk all things NHL Draft. Scott Wheeler, good friend of the show. National reporter covering the NHL Draft and prospects at The Athletic. Scott, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be back. It's that time of the year where I start to hear from shows like this that I've been on several times before, and it's always the annual, hey, you wanna run this back again? So happy to do it, and excited about getting down to Nashville. And I mean, we've got Memorial Cup and the Combine before that, as far as my purposes go, but really excited to get down to Nashville and see how this all plays out. I think this is going to be a pretty damn good draft 10, 15 years from now kind of thing.
I feel a little guilty now that you put it that way, because I don't think we've ever sent you a Christmas card. So maybe we should work on messaging you mid-season as well.
No, that wasn't a shot. I love this time of year.
All right, well, let's jump right into it. We were just talking before we hit record here that Detroit has picks 9 and 17 and what feels like 10 picks in a row potentially in the second round. So what do you see coming up for the Red Wings? I know you've already done a mock draft. They're not going to get Bedard. They're not going to get Fantilli. But what do they have in front of them opportunity-wise in your mind?
Well, I really think at 9, you're not likely to see them draft a defenseman. We all expect that David Reinbacher will be the sort of consensus number 1D in the draft, will be gone. And then after that, they just don't feel like among the teams that's going to take a swing on one of those sort of tier 2 defensemen in this draft. So an Axel Sandin Pellikka or a Tom Willander or a Dmitry Simashev, because of what they've got in Simon Edvinsson and Mo Seider, and because of the need for some sort of skill at forward and some depth at forward. it just feels like they're going to go forward there. So then there are really two camps in terms of the route that they could go with that pick. They could sort of do what they did a year ago and draft a future sort of second, third line center. There are going to be several guys who kind of fit that mold. You could see them take a Nate Danielson, a Brayden Yager, and Oliver Moore. I don't think Dalibor Dvorsky, who would kind of be an ideal scenario for them in that kind of a situation, is likely to be there. I think there's a chance that he's there. But really, if he's not, the centers, if you will, are Brayden Yager, Nate Danielson, and Oliver Moore in all likelihood. And then if not, there are tons of wingers. Like they could go in any number of directions with the wingers there. I think we do know at this point that they have a bit of a type. They want sort of competitive, hardworking players. I think that's a big part of their identity under Stevie Y. So if that's the case, you're probably not going to see them take a player like an Edward Chalet, who is kind of comes and goes in games and has questions about his competitiveness, and you won't see them sort of take that kind of a swing. But players like Colby Barlow are going to be there, and you go down the list. There are a number. Matthew Wood, not a super competitive kid per se, but he could be an option for them as kind of a scoring winger if they go the winger route. So I think they'll have a lot to consider there. It does feel like the draft is going to open up after sort of really, I think after Philly at 7. I think it's going to be wide open, and there are going to be teams in those ranges are going to be considering 7, 8, 9, 10 players. They're also a weird one just because they don't tend to draft out of the NTDP. It's just been a bit of a weird sort of hallmark of Stevie's sort of tenure, if you will. And two of the kids who in terms of consensus, who are going to be at the highest of the quote unquote consensus list, whether that's NHL Central Scouting or the ranking that we're likely going to see out of Bob McKenzie before this all concludes, are Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault, of course, right? Who are two very different wingers. Gabe is an extremely talented, sort of gifted playmaker, and Leonard does kind of fit with what you'd expect out of the Red Wings. He's that driver, that hardworking sort of. He's a smaller player at 5'11", but a very, very strong, stocky, athletic kid who plays kind of a powerful game out of a 5'11" player, and plays to chase hits and to be physical and to go to the net kind of recklessly, and just plays that sort of bulldog style. So I'll be interested to see whether they flip the script there and go with one of those two NTDP kids as well. So there really are at 9. I think they go forward, but even if they go forward, whether it's center or wing, there are probably 3 or 4 options at center, and then 6, 7, 8 options that could fit in that range on the wing.
So in that range, I'm glad you acknowledged that, center is where people look, because, me personally, I'm thinking, is this Oliver Moore, Dalibor Dvorsky, if you believe he's going to stick at center, obviously a great option there as well. Remove all positional bias of like Benson, Moore, Perreault, Dvorsky, Wood, Leonard, that range. Is there a best player available in your mind? Who among them, and regardless of their position?
Well, for me, in terms of my board, I can tell you right now that Zach Benson is going to finish at my final board, which will be out on June 5th. He's going to finish at number 6. So he's quite likely going to be the BPA there. Those 5 are going to be gone. I expect that even if Matvei Michkov falls, that he's gone one pick before the Red Wings at 8 to Washington. So yeah, the big 5 in this draft are going to be gone. And then of that next tier of those 5 or 6 players that you mentioned, and I think you've got it more or less bang on in terms of that sort of core next group. I would argue in favor of Zach Benson. But again, I was the guy who argued in favor of his Winnipeg Ice teammate, Matt Savoy, to the Red Wings last year, and they didn't go that route, right? And Savoy and Benson, believe it or not, actually have a lot in common. Savoy is a much better skater than Benson, but they're both likely going to be wingers at the next level. Obviously, Savoy's a natural center coming up, but is probably going to be a winger at the next level. They both play very, very competitive, sort of bigger than themselves games. They're both very physical players, despite being smaller. They're both sort of competitive off the puck, win a lot of battles, and then they're playmakers, right? They're drivers. I would argue that Benson is, despite being 5'9", is the driver on that Winnipeg Ice team and has been for each of the last 2 seasons. In fact, I would probably argue that he's been their best player at forward in each of the last 2 seasons, which says a lot considering the talent that that team has had at forward, whether it's Savoy, who I mentioned, Connor Geekie, Connor McLennan. They've gone out this year and added Zach Ostapchuk, who we all saw at the World Juniors, et cetera, et cetera. So he's not what you expect out of a sort of skilled 5'9" winger. He's one of the best defensive forwards in the WHL. He's a two-way player. He's all over the ice. He's a sort of energizer buddy out there. And then he's also got the skill. And Savoy is that in a lot of ways too. Just plays a very hard-driven game despite being a little bit of a smaller guy. Savoy's a couple of inches taller for sure than Benson, and a little bit heavier too. But I liked both of those players just to add a skill element to the Red Wings' pool. And I'll be interested to see whether they go where they didn't go last year in terms of just the Winnipeg Ice and that team and those two kids. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on, because I do think Benson will likely be there. I think you'll see Benson finish on Bob McKenzie's board, for example, his consensus list. I think you'll see him finish at 6'7". And then he, as always happens on draft day, small wingers fall. That's a tale as old as time. So I think he could go even a few picks past the Red Wings. But he's likely going to be my guy there in terms of the guy I would pound the table for. And then after that, I like Oliver Moore a lot. I've made that clear throughout the year. He's the best skater in the draft. He's also that sort of driver, competitive player who sort of lifts everybody else up and pulls everybody else into the fight, a lot like Benson does. So a lot to like about Moore, and just the idea of that speed behind Dylan Larkin's speed as kind of a 1-2 punch down the middle into the future could be a really interesting dynamic for the Red Wings if they're comfortable going with Moore. So those two guys would probably be the 1-2 that I'd argue for. But again, I wouldn't feel super opposed if they went with a Matt Wood or a Ryan Leonard, or sort of went a bit of a different direction either.
You mentioned Matvei Michkov, and if he fell, it wouldn't really be past 8 to Washington. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the Russian connection there, so that makes sense. Now, I think the consensus against the consensus, so to say, is that, yeah, there's the top 5 talents in terms of Bedard, Fantilli, Carlsson, Michkov, and then it looks like Will Smith, but a lot of big brains like yours are thinking Reinbacher is probably going to be the guy to smash that public consensus come draft day, because that's usually what happens, especially when it comes to defensemen. Is that what you see happening? And then if so, let's say Michkov does fall, is he the kind of talent where you would, overpay, go balls to the wall just to trade up to grab him if he's available for you at, say, 6, 7, or 8?
Probably not. He's probably not the kind of talent that I'm spending premium assets to move up and grab. I do expect that he's going to be gone at 5, 6, 7. I mean, we heard Keith Jones just yesterday go on air and talk about how they're going to rebuild the Flyers through the defense. So they're drafting at 7. I think I would be honestly probably pretty surprised if the Arizona Coyotes didn't strongly consider him at 6, just because they've gone forward repeatedly at the top of the draft. They took Connor Geekie and Logan Cooley with their first 2 picks last year. The year 2 years prior, they took Dylan Genther with their first pick. They're pretty well stocked there in terms of what's coming at forward. So I think Reinbacher would make a lot of sense for them there. And even Montreal at 5, if it goes Smith, Carlsson 3-4, and they're not comfortable with Michkov, then suddenly Reinbacher becomes probably sort of the plan 1B or plan 1C kind of thing for them. So I think he'll be gone, and I would argue that he's not the kind of, just because of the talent at forward and not the need necessarily for the Red Wings they don't have to go forward there, but it really does feel like that's the right play for them. And like that roster, if it's going to get over the hump, is going to need maybe not even one more sort of high skill guy at forward, but maybe even two. So this is an opportunity to at least get partly there. And again, just with Seider and Edmondson, it does feel like they have two pillars on the blue line that they can build around, and they don't necessarily have that coming at forward.
The need for scoring on this team was really evident this year, and I think there's sometimes a little bit of a misallocation of stress, wherein a team does poorly in one aspect over the course of a season, and then they look to that very next draft to resolve it. And we know the pipeline doesn't necessarily work that way. Acknowledging that, that's still the way I'm thinking right now. I agree with you. The Red Wings need that high-end talent because it just doesn't exist elsewhere in the system. So, consider both picks 9 and 17 here, but obviously pick 9 is going to be the more likely one. Who are the highest ceiling players, or the players who, aside from the risk that they pose, could have the most impact in that area where, you're not getting Connor Bedard, but with pick 9, you really maximize the amount of offensive talent you can get with this pick?
Well, I think if it's about pure goal scoring, if it's about the desire to have a shooter and add a shooter into the mix, then it's probably Ryan Leonard and Matt Wood. Those are two guys who can just rip it in very different ways. Leonard just overpowers goalies. He beats them cleanly with how hard he shoots it. And then he also just gets to the net and bangs in a lot of pucks and pounces on a lot of rebounds and makes a lot of plays sort of in the dirty areas. Wood is more of a sort of classic, sort of not perimeter shooter, but I always go to Tage Thompson just because they're both tall, lanky kids who went to UConn and sort of became first-round picks out of UConn. And they have that coaching staff at UConn has directly made that comparison to me. So obviously Tage is even taller than Matt Wood is, but Matt Wood is that sort of 6'3" perimeter scorer. I've heard people toss around sort of Patrick Laine in terms of not a super, super quick player, not a super... He argues, and he did this with me when I've spoken with him throughout this year, he actually argues that he's a very competitive player. And I do think there's some sneaky competitiveness there in terms of sort of willing to engage in battles. And he likes to run his mouth out there and get involved after the whistle. He's not shy out there. He's not sort of reserved in how he plays, but isn't certainly relative to a Ryan Leonard, isn't the bulldog either. So those two guys can definitely shoot it. Woods sort of shoots from the perimeter a little bit more of a sort of classic power play threat from the flank, that kind of a thing. But if it's just in terms of pure offensive upside, like pure point producing, and you don't care how those points come, I would probably argue that Gabe Perreault and Zach Benson are sort of right there as well. Perreault's probably the most purely gifted player. Does come with maybe a little bit more risk. I think Benson and Leonard are going to be NHLers. I think Matt Wood's going to be a good NHLer. Oliver Moore is going to be a good NHLer. There is a little bit of risk in Perreault that his game just doesn't really work at the NHL level quite as smoothly as those guys. But I think that if you're willing to be patient, and maybe the Red Wings aren't the team to be patient, maybe they don't want to wait 3 years and they'd rather wait 1 year for a kid like Matthew Wood, who's already been a point per game player at the college level and likely isn't going to want to stick around much longer if he goes back to UConn and is point per game player again next year. So Perreault he's skinny. That's the thing. He's 5'11", but he's skinny. He has worked very hard over the last couple of years to add weight. His brother Jacob, who's with the Ducks organization and was a first-round pick, is an extremely thick guy. He's obviously the son of Yannick, who was an NHL player for a long, long time. And so there is a lot of belief within that family that he's going to fill up really quickly here and get stronger and look like a pro and all of that. And a lot of that has come already over the last couple of years. He was like 130 pounds when he showed up to the NTDP. But in terms of pure talent, like puck on his stick, making defenders miss, making high-end plays, running a power play, the creativity, the hockey IQ, the skill, all of that, Perreault's probably going to be the sort of number one guy, quote unquote, in terms of the players that are available and that sort of true ceiling.
Last episode, we talked about Nate Danielson. We did a quick profile on him, and I think you mocked him to the Red Wings in your first post-lottery mock draft, and you cited a lot of things about, this is a very Steve Yzerman type of player, responsible 200-foot game, seems to be a little bit more ready than other players. But the questions we had were, what are his offensive, attributes, and what's the ceiling to his offensive game? So I was wondering what you made of Nate Danielson and whether you think he'd be a worthy pick at 9, or if that's more of a pick 17 kind of guy you'd aim for.
I think for me, that would be more of a pick 17 kind of guy, but it does feel like he's going to go higher than that. It feels like because of just how well liked he is, and you kind of touched on it, but he's 6'1", 6'2". He skates really well for that size. A lot of pro details. He's been a captain at lower levels. He's been a leader. He's played above his age group. A little bit on the older side, and the production isn't glossy considering he's been in the WHL for 3 years rather than 2. Right, so he's a 2004 who's produced above a point per game, kind of, albeit on a very bad Brandon team where he had to do a lot of it himself. So just a complicated player. The statistical profile does not suggest to me that he's a top 10 pick, but there's a lot of pro quality there, a lot of belief that he's going to be, if not a good second line center, then an excellent kind of productive third line center. And the player that scouts who are fans of him always go to is Dawson Mercer, who in hindsight is Dawson Mercer a top 10 pick? And the answer is, if they did it over, he'd probably, despite going in the teens, he'd probably be a top 10 guy. And 50-point players who are good NHL players and can play in a top 9 and make their lines better and play in a variety of situations. Those guys in hindsight normally sneak in just behind the true stars of every draft and are kind of the guys that you'd go, okay, if I'm drafting 10 and 11 and the Connor Bedards and Adam Fantillis and Leo Carlsons and Will Smiths all hit long-term and they're guys that still go high in the redraft, after those guys, it's typically the guys who have a Dawson Mercer type career. So the question is just, is that what you're looking for? Are they okay if he becomes a 50-point player rather than a 70-point player? And is the safety of him becoming that, is that a sort of gamble that they'd rather take rather than maybe taking a swing on a guy whose upside in terms of point production might be a little higher, like a Gabe Perreault, for example, but who may not have that sort of cost certainty. It may not be the sure thing and may not be 1 or 2 years away, maybe 3 or 4 years away kind of thing. So that's the calculation that they're going to have to make with that pick. And I think that just because of the way they've drafted in recent times, it would be not short-sighted to suggest that they suddenly pivot, but that's the kind of player that they have been drawn to in the past. That doesn't mean that they don't go after a Gabe Perreault this time and flip the script and recognize, as I'm sure they all do, that they need a little bit more skill. But it does feel like that would be a comfortable kind of Steve Yzerman, Detroit Red Wings selection. And then you've suddenly got a strong 1, 2, 3 down the middle with 2 young pieces that project as sort of second, third line centers.
Now, a player who you mentioned might not even be an option for Detroit at 9. A little bit of a mystery because he has a tale of 2 seasons. Dalibor Dvorsky's Allsvenskan play wasn't all that inspiring, but his international play has been great, which is what I think has shot him up the boards, especially with the U18s. What do you make of him? Is this a guy who's going to stick at center? Is he worthy of a top 9 pick? How much risk is in his game? And, if someone gets him at 9th overall, are they getting away with a steal?
I'm a big fan of Dvorsky. I've been a sort of strong proponent of him all year. It's funny how the conversation about him has gone, too, because he was a player who was in the sort of top 5 discussion 2 years ago. 2 years ago, at 15, 16 years old, he was already playing internationally for Slovakia's hockey clubs in terms of the national program there, playing at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup. He was more productive than that stellar age group last year when he was playing up with them. He was often out producing the Philip Mayshars, right? So that part, even Slavkovsky, he outproduced at Hlinka 2 summers ago. So that piece of it was really exciting. Then he was a point per game player as a 16-year-old at the J20 level and got into hockey Allsvenskan games. And there was a real belief that this kid might be the top 5 pick before the emergences of a Will Smith, for example. He was considered that next guy after that big 4 at the top. So that changed though. I did a feature on Dvorsky into into U18 Worlds. And right before that tournament, I spoke with several people at AIK, his coaches, his general manager there, guys who really, really are fond of him and big believers in him. And even they were like, I don't think he's a top 10 guy. I think he's more of a sort of 11 to 20 guy. And that's the sense that I get from NHL scouts. And then he goes into U18 Worlds and he's one of the best players in the tournament. He drags that team to a couple of upset wins without really a ton of talent on this Slovakia team. This was kind of supposed to be their step back. And then there they were, upsetting the Finns and getting into the medal games and all of that. So he was tremendous. And even then, he certainly sort of catapulted himself into that sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 conversation. And I do expect that he'll be gone now. But even then, he's been cast, and I think miscast, as kind of just this two-way, detail-oriented, pro-style center. And I think that actually misses on a lot of what his game truly is, which is he is unbelievable passing the puck from the half wall on the power play, just the way he saucers it and feathers it off of his backhand and forehand, the weight he puts on it, how high he wafts some of those passes and how sort of flat they land. He can pound his one-timer. There are not a lot of players at 17 years old who are comfortable with their one-timers. He can absolutely hammer it. I think there's more skill there. I think he's been cast as that center just because he's already sort of a 200-pound player. He's 6'1". He's played pro hockey, and I think that just automatically results in this belief of, okay, this kid's going to be a pro or a sort of two-way player. And I think he's certainly got a lot of that. His staff with the national teams and with AIK have all praised little details in his game, his stick work, his detail on face-offs, all of that. So he's definitely made an impression as a sort of two-way, well-rounded player, but I think there's more skill there. I don't think he's going to be, I always hear these sort of Michael Backlund comparisons and that type of player. I don't think he's going to be that player at all. He may have some two-way quality, but this isn't a Selke kind of guy for me. This is a player who I think has legit sort of offensive upside. As far as center or the wing, that's tricky. His skating isn't a strength. I think it's better than most people give him credit for, but I could imagine that going in both directions, just depending on the team that drafts him and where the openings are in the lineup when he turns pro. And he feels like the kind of guy who could just be a winger his whole career or could be a center his whole career. So I think you have to be open to the fact that maybe he's not a center, but certainly in terms of that sort of stick detail, face-off detail, the two-way games, or the two-way game, the fact that he is 6'1" and 200 pounds, there's a strong chance he sticks at center as well, I think.
I'm going to pull us over to defense here, which some people might be groaning as they hear me say that, but I think it's worth mentioning, desirable or not for Red Wings fans, there are two right-handed defensemen at the top of the defense class here this year in David Reinbacher and Axel Sandin Pellikka. The obvious context here is, yes, the Red Wings have Mo Seider as their first pair right D, but they also lost very productive Filip Hronek in the trade at the trade deadline to the Vancouver Canucks. So, some people are looking what's in the pipeline to replace him. Well, not much right now. And is one of Reinbacher or Sandin Pellikka going to be the solution? So who are those players to you? And I know you mentioned that you don't really see the Red Wings taking a defenseman at 9th overall, but do you think this could work at 17? Do you think this could work as a trade up from 17? How does this all fit in for you?
Well, I think Sandin Pellikka could be there at 17, especially with the emergence of, I would add, a third right-handed defenseman in Tom Willander. I think for a long time, it was just expected that Reinbacher was going to go in the top 10 and Sandin Pellikka was going to go quickly thereafter in the teens. I've had several NHL scouts tell me that that's the way they thought it was going to go, that Sandin Pellikka would go kind of 13, 14 and Reinbacher top 10. And now it does feel like there's a chance that Tom Willander of Rögle, obviously an organization that the Red Wings are extremely comfortable with Chris and Cam Abbott there and just the staff and the obvious connections through now at least 3 players. So that piece of it is interesting. I think Willander, if he's not gone by 17, could be a strong consideration for the Red Wings. He's headed north to North America next season. He's expected. I don't even think BU's made it public, but it's common knowledge that he's going to play at BU next year, and they're excited to sort of insert him into their top 4. And could even potentially be a candidate to play with someone like Elaine Hudson there. So Willander is a really, really interesting player. One of the very best skaters in the draft, sort of a 6'1" defender who just floats around the ice. He's just so smooth in terms of his transition game, whether that's defending the rush and locking it down in the neutral zone or skating pucks up ice and just activating that way. Not a very sort of compelling, ambitious player inside the offensive zone. Doesn't make a ton of plays sort of off the blue line and that kind of a thing. Kind of plays a simple game there where he can walk, because of his skating, he walks the line really well. He gets his shots through. He's got a decent shot. He'll hit seams and sort of manage the puck at the top of the umbrella on the power play and that kind of a thing, but isn't a dynamic. I wouldn't call him, for sure wouldn't call him a sort of dynamic offensive defenseman, but just a stud in every other way. Played 30 minutes a night for that Swedish team, which gave the Americans a test and nearly won gold for the second straight year at U18 Worlds this year. The staff in Rogla really wanted him to stay, and we're hoping that he wouldn't go to BU and all of that, and just projects kind of as a really good two-way sort of second pairing defenseman at the next level. And those are premium assets these days. So he's an interesting one. I think he's joined that conversation and wouldn't even be surprised if he were picked one or two picks kind of ahead of Sandin Pellikka in the teens there. And I think both of those guys would make a lot of sense for the Red Wings. Sandin Pellikka is a different player than very different player than say a Mo Seider or a Simon Edvinsson, just in terms of makeup, size. He's 5'11", but plays a very sort of hard, competitive, bigger than he looks style. Was the leader in penalty minutes on that team, on that J20 team in Skellefteå this year. Looked the part when he played with the men's pro team. Can penalty kill, can run a power play. Sort of an offensive tilt to his game for sure, but he's a strong defender and can play big minutes certainly at his age group, and I think he'll get there at the pro level eventually too. So those two guys, Sandin Pellikka and Willander, I think I'd be surprised if both of them were there, but I do think there's a small chance that one of them's there, and that the Red Wings strongly consider that, especially if they go center or winger with the first pick.
With the second pick now, I think in a more concerted way, I kind of want to ask if the Red Wings make both picks 9 and 17, I'm trying to consider players who could be an option there. And one that isn't talked about a lot, I'm wondering if we should be giving more attention. I know Max Bultman actually has pointed him out a couple times, is Samuel Honzek, the winger, the big winger who had that laceration that kind of took him off the radar for a little bit. I look at his play style, I look at his profile, and he seems to me like someone who fits the Red Wings mold and what they'd be interested in. Is Samuel Honzek a kind of overlooked player in this draft who potentially could go in the first half of the first round?
Yeah, he is. And he's a player that scouts really like. He's a player that entire coaching staff and management group with the Vancouver Giants have raved to me about all year. Whenever I've been on the phone or texting those guys, they're always talking just about how smooth he made it look. His English was very good right when he arrived. He was very coachable right when he arrived. There was like no adjustment for him in terms of the smaller ice surface. They all think he's a very, very intelligent player, and he just kind of got it right away in terms of where he needed to play, how he needed to sort of lift up his line mates on the smaller ice surface, all of that. So really smart player, obviously 6'4", that's appealing. Was productive, above a point per game in his first season in North America in the WHL on a team that didn't have a ton of talent around him in Vancouver. They've sort of in a bit of a transition period after having moved on from guys like Fabian Liesel over the last year and a half. So, obviously they also traded Ostapchuk at the deadline. So just a tricky situation for a first-year player to enter into, where you're already the guy, you don't have playoff aspirations, and he was great for them in virtually every area. Just a really smart, decent skill. Doesn't project to be sort of a high-end sort of point producer, but again, kind of in that if he can be a 50-point player, or sort of a 20-goal guy and 30-assist guy, like that's a $6-7 million player in the NHL these days, right? So, and I think there's a lot of belief that he can be that, kind of like Pavel Zacha and the success story that he became for the Boston Bruins this year, right? Like Zacha was a top 10 pick. He was kind of cast off as just going to be a two-way guy, didn't sort of live up to expectations with his first club, and now suddenly he's a very good player on a very good team and an important player in a variety of situations and all of that. And I think the expectation for Honzik is that that's kind of the player that he'll become, just a productive, good top 9 NHL player who's a part of a good sort of winning team kind of thing.
Look at the other players in that range. Within reason, what would you say are some best case scenarios for Detroit? I'm looking at Brayden Yager, Colby Barlow. You mentioned Willander. Maybe it's a Callum Ritchie or Riley Heidt. Are there players who you think Red Wings fans should absolutely be over the moon for if they're available at 17 for the Red Wings?
Well, I think you're quite likely going to see some of the wingers that are very high on my board that sort of linger. That always seems to happen. I think the Brayden Yagers are likely going to be gone. I think Oliver Moore is likely going to be gone when it sort of rolls back around. And that's not a foregone conclusion. I think there's a small chance that one of those players is still there. But I do think it's more likely you'll see a winger. I'm running through Corey and I are doing a joint 2-round mock draft right now, and we're about halfway through it, sort of going back and forth over the last few days. And it does feel every time I sit down and do one of these, and I'll have another one for myself right before the draft. But it just feels like you're going to have a Matthew Wood there and an Edward Chalet there. And if they really want to take a swing on some skill, that one of those, I think Chalet will likely be there. Chalet is one of the most talented players in the draft. Again, doesn't strike me as a Red Wings type per se. And I think that's part of the problem with him is there are a lot of teams that just don't love how he just kind of drifts around and floats around out there and then makes his skill plays when opportunities come kind of thing. But in terms of upside, potential point production, talent, power play upside, all of that, Chalet, I think he'll be there, and he'll probably be one of the more purely talented players available. So that's a name that I would keep an eye on. But yeah, I think you'll see guys like that, the Chalets, the Woods. Wood could likely be gone. He made a lot of fans in the second half of the season. You could see a Colby Barlow who's still there, goal scorer, so it would add that sort of scoring punch. Not a great skater, but already sort of a pro quality to him in terms of just how physically mature he is. There's been sort of joking around this year about a photo that emerged out of the CHL Top Prospects game where he was the captain and he was sitting next to the coaching staff as a result in the team photo out in Langley for the Top Prospects game. And he looks like a 35-year-old NHL veteran. If you sat him next to Brent Seabrook, who was involved in that event, you wouldn't know which one was Brent Seabrook and which one was draft eligible, right? So I'm sure there's appeal for a lot of teams in Barlow. He was the captain of his OHL team in his draft year, which is a pretty rare thing in Owen Sound. He sort of chased down 50 goals in his OHL draft year, which is a pretty rare thing. All of that physical, works his ass off out there. It's just the skating element and the fact that he's a winger that I think could have him linger to sort of the teens or early 20s. So those types of guys, I think the best player in terms of the best prospect available at that stage will again likely be a winger. So if they go winger at their first one, you'd probably be less likely to go back to that well with your second one. But if they go C at 9, then maybe a Barlow or a Wood or even a Chalet as a less likely candidate. Maybe one of those guys becomes a little bit more appealing. And then Ritchie's you mentioned Ritchie, so I'll touch on him quickly. But Ritchie and Quentin Musty, two OHL players, very different players. Musty's a winger, really big, like Barlow, very heavy kid, already over 200 pounds. More skill, I would say, in terms of playmaking than Barlow. But it just sort of looks like a professional athlete already kind of situation with Musty. And maybe there's appeal in a Barlow or a Musty for the Red Wings if they're looking for guys that are maybe a little bit closer to turning pro kind of thing. And then Ritchie's an interesting one. Ritchie's been dealing with a pretty major shoulder injury throughout the sort of latter half of this season. And it sounds like he's going to have surgery this summer on it. So that's a factor for teams, but was coming into this year a potential top 10 pick who's now kind of emerged as sort of a teens or early 20s kind of guy. He played on an Oshawa team that had virtually no talent, and he plays center which helps. He's got size. Centers with size typically don't last too long. And just really a lot of detail to his game, a lot of skill to his game. He's got a dangerous curl and drag wrister that he really likes to use often. Is going to be a power play guy, really good on face-offs, has played both center and the wing. Lots of appeal in a player like Callum Ritchie, even with the injury question marks. So yeah, I think those are the guys that you're zeroing in there. I think you're bang on that it's a Barlow, it's a Musty, it's a Ritchie. And then those defensemen that we highlighted earlier, like a Willander or an Axel Sandin Pellikka, if they're still there.
Now, the Red Wings seem to have what is a whole bucket full of second-round picks in or around the first half of the second round. So are there any players with those 3 picks, provided the Red Wings keep them all, which I don't think is necessarily the most likely outcome, but imagining they do, are there any players who you really like in the second round or you think are going to fall out of the first round that the Red Wings could target there?
Yeah, most definitely. And it's going to be interesting because teams always get, and I think this is actually has become a bit of a hindrance to having 3 picks in a row, which it looks like they will, unless they move one or whatnot. But teams like to get cheeky with those, right? Yeah, I think you could see them draft a goalie just because they have 3. I think you could see them draft a forward, a defenseman, and a goalie just because they have 3. I think you could see them draft a player in the 2 players in that group that maybe people expect in that range, and a third guy that they don't think is going to be available for their third rounder, so they just pounce and take him there, kind of thing. It's not uncommon when there's 3 picks clustered together like that a scout at the table says, I know this guy is a guy that's more of a third round guy, but we really like him. Let's take him here anyways, kind of thing. So there's always that urge when you have that many just to play around with them and to view it as a luxury. I think more often than not, you'd be better off just sort of not allowing your mind to go there and just focusing on, okay, let's just try to make sure we really hit on these. But in saying that, there's a few players who I think could linger that I like a lot. Jaden Perreault, a player out of Chicago who sort of fits into that mold of the types of sort of really intelligent sort of navigators of the ice that program just seems to crank out. Obviously, Brendan Brisson was one. Sean Farrell was another. Sean Farrell's now turned pro with the Montreal Canadiens and should compete for time there next year. And they are head over heels in terms of their belief that Jaden Perreault is going to, despite being a 5'9" winger, is going to be an NHL player and potentially be a point producing one as well. So Perron's a player who I think will sort of linger in that range. It's typically the smaller guys, right? Like I think you could well see a Bradley Nadeau who absolutely torched the BCHL this year and is one of the only players who will likely potentially be available on day 2 who has legitimate top 6 upside if everything breaks well. I think there's even a chance that Andrew Cristall, who was one of the most productive players in the CHL this year, and if not for injury, could have had 110, 120 points in his draft year, which is more than what some first overall picks out of the WHL have produced, right? He produced more this year than Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, a first overall pick, Nolan Patrick, a second overall pick. And he had a truly, in terms of statistical profile, the kind of season that you'd expect a player to go in the top 10 with. But because he's 5'9", 5'10", and he's one of the slower players in the draft, I think you could see Andrew Cristall around on day 2, the sort of start of day 2. So those always on day 2, look at those smaller wingers. We saw it last year with Jordan Dumais, right, who went early on day 2 to Columbus and then got an entry-level contract right away when he was the most productive player outside of Connor Bedard in the CHL this year, and will be a big part of that World Junior team next year, and has now sort of completely firmly established himself as a guy who, despite being 5'9" and slow, like Andrew Cristall, is going to play in the NHL, and everybody, I think, expects that that's going to happen now. So just always the small wingers early on day 2. And then there are some, if they go with sort of bigger, heavier guys, I think there's a chance that you see guys like Danny Nelson, Kasper Halttunen, Charlie Stramel, kind of the men of the draft who aren't quite talented enough to all go in the first round. I think you'll see two of those 3 guys still available early day 2. They're all sort of 6'3", 210 pounds already, like just monstrous physically mature, strong, bulky guys who also have some skill and sort of project as sort of middle six guys. I don't think any of Stramel, Halttunen, or Danny Nelson are going to be first line, maybe not even second line players, but I think there's a good chance that each of those three players becomes a good NHL player. And if you can get that in the second round, that's still good value. So I think there's two ends of the spectrum in terms of the players that are typically available. You've got those big guys who project as sort of lower event NHL forwards, and then you've got the little skill guys that typically linger. And by then, normally the true premium defenders are all gone.
All right, Scott, this has been amazing. I have one more for you, and I know I always do this to you, and I'm sure you hate it, but I'm going to put you in the GM's chair here, thinking purely of picks 9 and 17, and in the way you imagine with your best guess the draft is going to shake out. Are there any players who you think the Red Wings could, or should, I should say, trade up for using their assets because they'll be at, picks 6 to 8 or 12 to 15. And you think, yes, this guy's absolutely worth overspending for because you want to walk away with him in addition to whoever else they draft.
I think the play at 9 is to hold it and to if it were me, to swing on the talent of a Zach Benson or a Gabe Perreault. I think there will be, if I were sort of in the chair, there would be more of an inkling to move up from 17 and maybe try to get another one of those guys. I think you can really move the needle in terms of they've got some well-rounded players. They've got guys who are going to project as sort of two-way top 9 forwards. If they could add 2 sort of premium point producers, 2 skill guys with those 2 picks, I think that really sort of changes the outlook for what that top 9 could look like long term. And I think if you were to move up from 17 to 12 or 13, that you could well get a Zach Benson and a Gabe Perreault. I don't think that's that's a reach or a sort of long shot scenario. Now you have to move up and take that swing, but that's the way I would approach it. Go out and get 2 guys, 2 PP1 guys, 2 guys who are going to sort of put up points, and you can surround those guys with the heavier checkers, the sort of more well-rounded players. Although, as I mentioned, Benson is one of the most well-rounded forwards in terms of two-way play and competitiveness in this draft. But yeah, I think that would be my best case scenario if I were the one making the decisions, would be try and get 2 of the true skill guys in the draft. And the most likely sort of candidates in that range, with staying at 9 and moving up from 17, would be something like Perreault and then Benson, or Benson and then Perreault.
All right, Scott, thank you so much. I know you're actually doing this while you're under the weather, so I'm blown away by your capacity to just deliver this all, off the cuff. This has been incredible. Folks, this is Scott Wheeler from The Athletic, at Scott C. Wheeler on Twitter. Please go follow him if you don't already. And we're going to link to a couple of his articles in the description of this episode. Much like we say always with Max, Scott's work is excellent, imperative even at draft time. So worth the price of admission for The Athletic to go read Scott's work. Scott, thank you so much, man. I hope you feel better soon. And until next time.
Thanks, Ryan. Cheers, buddy.
All right, welcome back. That was our interview with Scott Wheeler. Again, shout out to Scott for powering through that episode. Really, really great insights from him. I loved what he said at the end when I posed that question to him of what do you do in a trade scenario? Do you move up from 9 or do you move up from 17? And he advocated for, and I know this is like a pretty pie in the sky goal, but you grab one of the USNTDP guys or the skill guy at 9, and then with pick 17, if you can couple that with, one or some of your other assets, especially those second round picks, and grab another one of those players, depending on how much you can move up. Like, imagine the Red Wings walk away with Wood and Leonard, or Moore and Perreault, or like that would be an excellent haul.
Grabbing 2 of the 4 USNTDP guys, me and Scott are on the same wavelength.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're saying this, and the Scott mentioned that the Red Wings haven't gone to the USNTDP well too many times, but then I will say I don't think that's because they're averse to it. I think it's just they just haven't been in range really to grab those guys.
Yeah, I was gonna say, who was the last guy that they true USNTDP guy that they didn't pick that ended up being like a grand slam, whereas it was an obvious they should have picked him instead? Because the last really truly great NTDP kid they passed on that they could have picked was Zegras. And they still made the right pick. So
took Mo Seider there.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't, could you argue Sanderson over Raymond? I wouldn't, but some might.
In the year they took Edvinsson, who was the next USNTDP player, Tyler Boucher.
Yeah, and he was a massive reach at 10, and that pick has aged horribly for Ottawa.
Chaz Lucius went at 18. It's...
So again, it's not like they're not going to the NTDP. It's just been the options where they pick are not even in consideration for the best option. Again, outside of Zegras, but Zegras was still the second best pick at that pick.
Something about the draft that I think the last episode someone sent me a note that I was using the term late birthday and overager interchangeably, which I should not have been doing. So I want to clarify something. When we talk about late birthday in the NHL draft, essentially what we're talking about is a player who's played an additional year in junior because he wasn't eligible for a lot of his peers' draft year. So to be eligible for the NHL draft, any North American player who turns 18 by September 15th and does not turn 20 by December 31st is eligible. So if you are turning 18 on September 16th, you are pushed to the next year's draft. And thus, you are playing junior or whatever league a year longer, you're bigger, you're stronger, you're older than the guys you're playing against on average, and thus you should perform better. So sometimes that produces inflated statistics, performances, and folks then, like Brad, you say a lot, you do get concerned about late birthdays because of that.
Yeah, again, I know that was relative to Danielson, who has less production than some of the other CHL players that are projected in the same range as him, and he's a year older than all of them. So that's where I get concerns, at least in terms of, when you're looking at offensive ceiling, because if you want to look at, I think I use the example of Cal Ritchie and Nate Danielson as okay, these guys are very similar in terms of where they might go, whatever. Cal Ritchie's a 2005. Danielson's a 2004, and that is significant in this context.
These are formative years, not just in their growth physically, but the development of their game as well. I also mentioned North American players. It also applies to non-North American players. They can be drafted at any age, but they still have to be 18 by September 15th. So there's just the within 20 cap in there. That changes. Okay. The World Championships, a quick update on what the Red Wings players are doing there. Dominik Kubalik, 3 goals, 3 assists over there, which he's doing great for Czechia. Veleno with 2 goals and 3 assists. Berggren has 3 helpers to his name. Raymond has a goal and assist and 2 shootout goals. Pretty sweet performance by him. Carter Mazur has a goal and assist, including a great rip from open space in the slot today. That was a sneaky good release.
Yeah, he's got a really, really good release. So if he turns into a guy who's really good around the net and can be dangerous from anywhere in the home plate area, that really opens up options in terms of how they want to use him.
And Seider has a helper, and Mata has a couple, I believe. So lots of Red Wings to follow there, performing well. Conference finals. All happening very south in North America. Carolina, Florida.
Just like we all predicted.
Vegas, Dallas.
Like a lot of people actually predicted.
Yeah. That Vegas, Dallas, to me right now, it genuinely feels like whoever comes out of that series, provided that they don't kill each other, is going to be the favorite to win the cup, right?
I would agree with how banged up Carolina is right now. That's probably a fair statement.
But Carolina has just been getting better and better as their playoff run has gone. At the same time, how do you discount Florida, who has been a king killer, twice now, depending on how much you really believed in Toronto? But every team, and Dallas might be the perfect team on paper that's left. If you're I genuinely don't know how to handicap this in terms of which team is favored, but
I'll go ahead and say the 8 seed is the underdog and everybody else is reasonable.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
But then again, okay, you're taking Carolina over Florida, and how many games?
I didn't say that.
Okay, so what are you?
I might be, but I would say Florida is probably the only team I would classify as an underdog out of, against Carolina, they're an underdog. If they make the finals, they'd be the underdog. I don't think Dallas or Vegas can be considered an underdog in that series, and I don't think they'd be considered an underdog if either of them made the finals. So I don't know. It's a really, really fun matchup because Florida's on a heater. I'm still taking Carolina because I don't have faith in Bobrovsky. So I'll say Carolina in 6. I understand how good Bobrovsky's been, but like he's always kind of been inconsistent. So 2 bad games in that series could be torched for them.
Or he goalies them.
He could.
Which,
it's very much in the range of possibility.
How are you feeling about them?
Yeah, that series, do you go with Florida, who's kind of excelled at being an underdog and has really embraced that role? You go with Carolina, who's, sort of defied the odds in terms of, they're injured, but somehow they've made it all the way through. Florida's done a lot to inspire me, and they've hit their stride at the perfect time. And, maybe playing Carolina is sort of like releasing the parachute, and they can just run free at this point. I'll go Florida in 7.
Whoa.
I was going to make the point that Carolina's only lost 3 games these whole playoffs, but then Florida's only lost 4.
They're going to make us both look all of us look stupid when they go in and actually, beat whoever comes out of the West.
Oh, that could happen.
I think I'm going to buy into the Bobrovsky heater as well.
Hell yeah.
I think I'm going to go Florida in 7. Is Carolina favored? Yeah, I totally agree. Has Carolina been getting better and better, and does Rod Brind'Amour have that team running through a wall right now? Absolutely. Getting goalied is like a armor-piercing shell. Like that can ruin anyone. And I think if Bobrovsky's doing that, then he can disrupt. That said, that might be the hottest take I have of all playoffs, and my bracket has been insanely wrong from the moment I picked it. So Florida in 7, knowing I'll look like an idiot.
Like I'm also kind of going by the universe against the Leafs theory here too, which is out of this series, what's the worst case scenario for Leaf fans? And Freddie Anderson backstopping a team to the Cup final, I think, is very high up that list. So the universe will will it into existence.
That is a fantastic point, Brad. And then Dallas Vegas. What kind of informed opinion can you have about that one? Like Jack Eichel, and as a Jack Eichel truther, I am so smug about this, but I'm so happy he's at the head of the Conn Smythe conversation. And then you have Dallas, who beat a very tenacious Seattle team, who put them to the test. Like I'm gonna say Vegas, and I just don't see how it's not 7 games.
Yeah, I think 7 games is probably the most realistic guess of what you could do in this series because the teams are so evenly matched. I think I said before we even started our playoff brackets, like, why is nobody talking about Vegas? It seems like nobody's talking about Vegas. Did everybody forget they finished first in the West? And sure enough, here they are cruising to the conference final. So I'm going to stay on my Vegas bandwagon, and I'll take them in 7 as well.
Yeah, this one's tough because I love the goaltending that Jake Ottinger provides Dallas, but I like Vegas as a team better. I think they play better as a team. They play, I feel like, with better structure. But man, I find it so hard to bet against Dallas, but I also find it incredibly difficult to go against Vegas after they've kind of just run every team's show so far. Just to be different, I'll say Dallas in 7, but I don't like that at all.
I also kind of want to see Dallas and Florida go to the final just to watch old hockey men articles explode when it's Florida versus Texas in the Cup Finals.
Okay, the thing about Jake Ottinger is generally I agree with you, Evan. He's struggled. 903 save percentage, 275 goals against average. Like, he's not been on form, and his performance was a big reason why they had that scare against Seattle. So I'm a big believer in the hot hand in the playoffs, and I can absolutely see, an Adin Hill lifting the cup in the Stanley Cup Finals just because he got hot for the right 12 to 16 game stretch. Obviously, Brossoit got injured, so that's how he factored in, but he's come in. He has a 934 save percentage, 219 goals against average in 5 games. Like, that's what wins you a series. So credit to him. If Ottinger doesn't figure it out and Vegas isn't going to be an easy team to figure it out against, that's what concerns me. But I do agree. The way Dallas is constructed on paper, that's a team who, by all rights, should be poised to make a cup run. The West is strong. Like for the East, I see teams who have like flashes or certain aspects of their teams that are like really fantastic, and that's how they overcame the hurdles of New Jersey or Toronto or Boston or whatever. But the West, I just see complete teams that are just tanks
built for playoffs.
Yeah. And think of those markets like Dallas, Florida, Carolina, Vegas. First of all, Vegas back deep in the playoffs. The league is, laughing all the way to the bank about that one. But those are, non-traditional hockey markets. And as a hockey purist, as a hockey traditionalist, whatever that means, I love that. That is incredible. That is exactly what the game needs. Yeah, if Toronto's there or Chicago's there or Boston's there, original six team is there, that's like printing money. But there's nothing better for a new market or a non-traditional market to cement fans and to watch that team win. Because it's the greatest game on earth. And to a playoff run is the most fun you can have in North American sports in my mind.
This is the better investment for the long-term future of the league. Boston or Toronto makes more money now, but growing a bigger fan base in a Florida, Carolina, whatever, is better for the sport overall. Especially considering of the four teams that are left, two of them have never won a Stanley Cup. And of the teams that have won a Stanley Cup, the most recent one was Carolina all the way back in 2006.
That's insane.
So either way, someone is getting some. There are going to be a healthy amount of adult fans who won't remember their team winning the cup that will get to do that this year, no matter who wins.
All right. That's all for now. We're going to jump into overtime. Overtime is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/wingedwheel podcast if you want to support the show. Again, you help the growth of the show, the Jamie Daniels Foundation and our support of them, our expanded content universe like Expected by Whom, and you get benefits like our bonus episodes, our Patreon exclusive Discord, and you're automatically entered into all of our giveaways. So patreon.com/wingedwheel podcast. Some questions here. Jefferson Steelflex says, can you guys explain why Oliver Moore is ranked higher than Gabe Perreault on so many mocks? I get that Moore is a center and Perreault has better line mates, but he has nearly 60 more points in only 2 more games, and he is even a few months younger. If you threw positional preference out the window and just went for best player, do you take Perreault?
This is a tools thing. Moore's the 200-foot burner, right? So there's a very easy way to project him into the NHL, whereas Perreault, you're really counting on his brain and his sense to carry him, which I'm a big believer in. Like, that is something I absolutely subscribe to. But his tools, his skating and his shot aren't as projectable. Well, Moore doesn't have a great shot, but his skating definitely isn't projectable to the NHL, whereas Oliver Moore's is. So I don't know if it's a certainty thing versus an upside thing. I'm fully comfortable with either of them at 9. Oliver Moore is way more a Detroit type, but I think the Red Wings need a Gabe Perreault a little bit more. So, I guess it just kind of depends on your faith in translatability with Perreault's tools.
Detroit Ed Day Ingsway, thank you for that, says, with the news out of Tempe, it looks like it's very probable that the Coyotes are going to have to move. My condolences to their fans. They didn't deserve to be put through the ringer for so long. What do you guys think the timeline is for relocation? Are the Coyotes still in Arizona at the start of the season? Is there a chance that the team will be relocated before the summer's draft?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question because I forgot to bring it up earlier because it's relevant. The last time something like this happened was when Atlanta went to Winnipeg. That move was announced, I believe, on May 31st. So there is a reality the Coyotes will be out of Arizona by this season. However, Winnipeg had a hockey arena ready to go immediately. I don't think any of the potential suitors outside of Quebec City do, to the point where, Houston and Salt Lake City have NBA arenas, but again, to retrofit them for hockey might not be viable. So I still think the most likely scenario is they play out next season in Arizona, but it does give them more time to do their due diligence and allow bidders to better accommodate an NHL team on that timeline.
The Angry Ginger says, with the Gudas contract coming up, could you see Yzerman going after him to get rid of the need for Osterley, Lindstrom, and Hag? Would it have to be as bad of a contract as Sherratt's to get him? Are there any similar players in this free agency class that would make more sense and be more affordable? Could see it being fun having Seider, Wallman, Gudas, Edvinsson, and Sherratt Mata. Gudas will command a premium. The longer he goes in the playoffs, the more of a premium he'll get because he is on the face of a lot of Florida's success. Hate him or not, he's effective. I almost think he might be overpaid, not in actual dollars, but relative to value. He might be overpaid more than Severson will be this UFA class. That said, I would still love Radko Gudas on the Red Wings.
And I don't think his contract will be to what Ben Sherratt's is, mainly just because he didn't have the rep, and I think he's a little older than Sherratt was when Sherratt signed his contract.
Radko Gudas turns 33 this summer.
Yeah. So if you're looking for someone comparable, I know Scott Mayfield's been brought up a lot. Again, not a one-to-one comparison, but kind of the closest you're going to get here.
Mm-hmm. Matt McKay says, hey guys, what would it take to get Keller from the Coyotes, and would the juice be worth the squeeze?
Well, in my hypothetical trade proposal, it is, but that's a tough one. I would, the Red Wings desperately need someone like a Clayton Keller, so it would make a ton of sense to trade for a Clayton Keller. The price would be steep, but the Red Wings are so loaded with assets, and the Coyotes do want futures. This is a trade that could also make a ton of sense. And for what it's worth, I've been on the Nick Schmaltz train for a while, and I still am.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And last one here. Brian Graham says, let's play What If. What if we had gotten Lafreniere back in 2020? How much better do you think he'd be if he had been drafted by Detroit and gotten top 6 minutes consistently? Also, what if we tried to trade for him now? What would it take? I just need some comfort after the lottery last week, so I want to imagine a better world. That's an interesting one, and it's tough because Lafreniere has not performed anywhere close to being a first overall pick. And he was supposed to be a really good first overall pick, too. Like, one of the better ones.
Late birthday.
Still, I can't help but shake that something is in the water in New York, and whatever they did with their prospects just hasn't worked. I have to imagine there was more that could be had from Lafreniere this early. Now, what we're left with is this. I don't know if he's redeemable. I don't know if you run it back with another team that you don't run into the same thing because it's actually all on Lafreniere rather than just some. I don't know. But I genuinely can't shake the feeling that, yeah, if another team had done it in a different way, he would have excelled more. He was just too good coming in. He was too good coming in to be this. No, he's not bad, but he's not first overall pick.
You could probably get him for the 17th overall pick, I would guess.
And we've talked about that before. Do you do it?
I wouldn't. I wouldn't be upset if they did. But God, for me, this is the impossible question because it's right on that fringe. Like, how does the draft board break down? You know what I mean?
Yep.
Would I trade Oliver Moore straight up for Alexei Lafreniere right now? I would not. If Oliver Moore and Sandin Pellikka and, player X, Y, and Z that I really like are off the board, yeah, okay, then I don't love anybody there. Of course I would trade that pick for him. But yeah, I don't know. This is how you know it's a good trade proposal when you're conflicted. Always remember that. If you propose a trade in your head and you go, I do that in a heartbeat, it's a bad trade proposal.
It's hard because the production's not there, like a quarter of a point per game-ish last season. A little bit more than that. That's hard to say, yeah, you want to trade 17th overall for. But if any part of you believes that there's a lot more development to come, which you should because he's young, and B, there's more that's been really left untapped there, he's still young. You can still extract that. I don't know that you're banking on first overall pick performance, but
and also in a normal draft, 17th overall usually does not equate a star. That usually equates like a third liner.
That's right.
So you have to keep value with that perspective in mind. And Alexei Lafreniere is already that. But this isn't a normal draft. So you also have to keep that in the back of your mind.
Anyhow, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you all so much. Next episode is going to be we're going to run back the schedule from this week. So it's going to be another Monday, Thursday posting. So appreciate everyone bearing with us as we adjust our schedules as the throws this summer come through. But it doesn't mean we're bringing you any less great content. As always, thank you all so much for tuning in. For those of you who support on Patreon, it means the world. If you want to support in other ways and can't support on Patreon, give us a rating. Wherever you listen to the podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever, give us a rating and subscribe. It makes a big difference for us when you do those things. So To all of our listeners, new and old, we appreciate you. And to all of our name level supporters on Patreon. Arjun Shankar, Yves Bartels on behalf of the Sarah Grand Foundation, Aikfer, Leafson9, Icon, We Are Geelong, the greatest team of all, Glenn Brabham, The Hat 123, Keenan O'Donohue, Yanni Burgers, Meals on Wheels, Matthew M. Rice, Croner's Left Knee, Admiral Matt S. of the Cheesebag Navy, Babe Landeskog, Bros Before Hosas, Carl Brutanen and Oluski, Chimmy, Chris P., Citizen High Five, Connor Scovey, Cookin' with Kosa, Coyote season tickets in anywhere but Tempe. Oh, I'm sorry. Denny's Gamer Girl, Derek Enstam, DJ Denton, Give Blood, Fight Probert, Hockeytown Matt, Hassam Al-Qassem, I Miss Cronwall, Jay Gollum, Jacob Turner, Joel Miranda, Kalen Wood, Kevin James, King Tone, Marcus, Matt McKay, Michael Edlund, R.A., Red 3, Ryan Hubbard, Ryan, the Ryan Hannah, Scott Martin, That's What I Appreciates About You, Wallman's Elite Dancing D, General Andy Bohan of the Cheesebag Army, Sam Bankson, #1 Red Guys fan, A.A. Ron, Adam Gowitzka, Adam Rose, Brad Simmons, Brian Vasha, Captain Antonio Gracias of the United Federation of Cheesebags, C.J. Wilkinson, Commander Ben Barron of the Cheesebag Space Force, Connor Leighton, Corey Prida, Darren Fick, Dungeon Master of Puppets, Frank Stanley, Gene Sullivan, Grand Rapids Hockey Guy, Griffey Boy, I Can't Decide on My Next Patreon Name, Instructions Unclear, Cheesebag No Longer Fresh, James Laporte, Jeremiah Dobo, J.M. Rhapsody, John Evans, John Ingalls, Josh Yelton, Kevin McCracken, Quaz, Linda Hull, Matt Keeler, Maximilian, Melissa Erickson, O. Ophelia, Steven, Tatar Sauce, The Hodag, The Original, Button a Lemon, and the St. Louis Blueth. Thank you all so much. We'll talk to you Monday.
Thanks for tuning in to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Be sure to check out wingedwheelpodcast.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll also find links to other ways to support the show, such as Patreon, official podcast apparel, and more. And don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at Winged Wheel Pod. And of course, the hosts at Brad Crisco, at Ryan Hanna WWP, and at Hockeytown Evan.